Saturday, March the 20th, 1982, Shabbat HaChodesh, Vayakhel Today. Please turn in the Chumashim to page 253. Page 253, the special reading for Shabbat HaChodesh. This is the fourth of the special Sabbaths. There are 5 altogether which precede Passover. Shabbat Shekalim, Shabbat Zachor, Shabbat Parah, Shabbat HaChodesh, and Shabbat HaGadol. And we announce today the new moon of Nisan. The reading is found on page 253. It is from the book of Exodus. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak ye unto all the congregation of Israel, saying, In the 10th day of this month they shall take to them every man a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for a household. And if the household be too little for a lamb, then shall he and his neighbor next unto his house take one according to the number of the souls, according to every man's eating, ye shall make your count for the lamb. They must have known each other pretty well. I mean, it looks as if they knew everybody's intake. Joe likes the whole leg. I mean, you know, it says so here. Ish lefi ochlo, everyone according to his eating. They must have known, you know, it's like when you serve food in the house, you know, so-and-so has a big appetite, so-and-so has a small appetite, this one likes 3 scoops of potatoes. They knew it. They had to work it out very carefully. According to every man's eating, you shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. It shall be taken from the sheep or from the goats. I thought a baby goat was a kid, not a lamb. Have you ever heard of a... How can a lamb be either a goat or a sheep? Do we have any idea? Or what is it saying? That it doesn't matter what kind of an animal it is? A kid is a baby lamb? A lamb is a baby sheep. A kid is a baby goat. Am I right? Not that I'm an expert in these matters. Do we have anybody who is an expert in animals in the house? Are there any animals in the house? No? Well, ye shall keep it unto the 14th day of the month, and the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at dusk. What does that sound like? That sounds like one lamb or lots of lambs? Yeah, but wouldn't you say there's an overtone that everybody's killing one lamb in this particular verse, or is it my imagination? Would you agree that there's a possible reading that they're all killing one lamb? And they shall take of the blood and put it on the 2 side posts on the lintel. The commentaries incidentally point out that the blood, I only learnt this recently, the blood was not sprinkled outside of the house, but only on the inside. I always was of the opinion that the reason why the blood was sprinkled on the outside was so that the angel of death would pass over and know how to distinguish between the Israelite houses and the Egyptian houses. But Rashi says very clearly that the blood was sprinkled inside, was not visible outside, but that God, for whom inside and outside are all the same, would know which were the houses of the Hebrews and which were the houses of the Egyptians. Something very curious there. Very curious. Why was the blood not sprinkled on the outside, only on the inside? And they shall eat the flesh on that night, roast with fire, unleavened bread with bitter herbs. Eat not of it raw, nor sodden at all with water, but roast with fire, its head with its legs, with the inwards thereof. And ye shall let nothing of it remain until the morning, but that which remaineth of it until the morning ye shall burn with fire. And thus shall ye eat it, with your loins girded, your shoes on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and ye shall eat it in haste, for it is the Lord's Passover. What does this remind you of? Let's forget about Passover for a moment. What is this? What is going on here? What is the lamb? What is the lamb that is the center of interest at this time of the year? Professor Bassman? What's going on here?
Well, it's a communal sacrifice.
What?
It's a communal sacrifice.
Yeah, but who's being sacrificed?
God.
Huh?
Well,
Did you say God?
not our God.
You mean the other guy's God? Yemen's.
I tell you that frankly what I thought about immediately was last week.
Why do you think I asked you, Professor Bassman? I had a...
Why do you ask me?
Well, we had a reservation. One of the Bassman family, who I will not mention by name, sent me a very interesting comment on last week's discussion, which leads directly into this week's discussion, and I'll read it in a moment, or I will just read from it in a moment. Please.
No, I think it's better to read it. It's clear. Like Joseph Campbell.
Warren?
I was going to say that it's a substitute for the sacrifice of children with the coming of spring.
I don't think you better talk about sacrificing children with the coming of spring at the SAJ, Warren, at this time. It's a very delicate topic. I'd like to think... I'd like substitute. No, I'd like to think it was the children. I'm afraid it was the rabbi. No, it was the... we're at the totem. This is a totem feast. All the evidence points to the fact that that harmless-looking piece of matzah on our tables in 2.5 weeks' time once was a live, kicking human being who was killed. Actually, today, you see, we think that we make conscious decisions about having reviews in which various spiritual leaders are taken to task for their sins and shortcomings, but how accidentally on purpose it arrives precisely on the day when the planets are in the correct conjunction. Unawares of it's what Hegel calls the cunning of history. Man proposes, mythology disposes. That is to say, there is an undercurrent. What we are going to witness this evening, fortunately, is a very modified form of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, which also takes place at this time of the year. I'm very glad that Elisha has no nails. Although I had thought of anticipating any trouble by walking in with my cross on my back, having gone through the 7 stages of the Magen David through Central Park. I'm sorry? Now that takes place before the crucifixion. Now I want to speak. Yes, Elisha, please, reassure me, Elisha. Yes. No, excuse me. I've been asked. I have been asked to ask those who participate in the discussion to stand because people can't hear. So, please, I don't want to embarrass anybody. Can you rise? Thank you.
I just been handed this small screw device. You'll need that later.
That's okay. No, quite seriously, let me just give you a few examples of what we're talking about here. Let me start with a quotation which Sheila sent me. We were talking last week about, and this was quite new to me, although I have read this book. It's a book by Joseph Campbell called The Flight of the Wild Gander. We spoke last week of the reason why the special Sabbath, Shabbat Parah, had this reading for which described how this red cow was burnt and mixed with the ashes were mixed with water, and it was used for purifying people. Ostensibly, the purification had something to do with the sacrifice that was offered in the temple on Passover, the Korban Pesach, the lamb which we heard described in here this morning. When the temple stood, and we have eyewitness accounts of this both in the Mishnah and also in Josephus. People, the families, brought the lamb to the temple. They did it in droves. There were thousands upon thousands of them. They had to have them in shifts. After the first shift went in, the doors of the temple were locked, and then when they were finished with their sacrificing, they went home with their animals and started their barbecues, because in the time when the temple stood, Passover was a religious barbecue. That's what it was. It was a religious barbecue. Passover was the lamb, the entire family ate the lamb. Now, the rabbis link the cow, the red cow, the ashes of which mixed with water purified the unclean. They link that red cow with the golden calf, which Aaron makes while Moses is up in the mountain. And when Moses comes down, what he does is take the golden calf, grinds it, mixes it with water, and feeds it to the children of Israel. What I did not realize last week, and I'm very glad that Sheila drew my attention to it, is that both the red heifer and the golden calf story, which is always read just before Passover, are both prefigurations of the original primitive totem feast, which underlies this part of the year, and also the ways in which different religious denominations try to avoid repeating the original tragedy of taking somebody and killing them at this time of the year in order to cope with spring, because that is the central point that we're talking about. In time gone by, we're talking about this is a very primitive period of time, and we don't know the whole story, but we have enough evidence to be able to construct the outer limits of what happened. The most gifted and the most talented member or leader of the group, those of you, I'm sure some of you must have read Mary Renault's book, The King Must Die. That's what we're talking about at this time of the year. The idea that in order for the community to survive and endure another year, they have a need to kill and incorporate. That's the crucial aspect of it. Incorporate, devour, eat the representative, the leader of the community. There are different versions, but most of them add up to the same story. And that strength will enable them to live through the other year, and more crucially, will fructify the soil. Campbell, in this book, draws attention to the fact that when, I quote, at the foot of Mount Sinai, the high priest Aaron was found conducting a festival of the moon bull in the image of a golden calf, which Moses angrily committed to the fire, ground to bits, mixed with water, and caused the people to drink in a kind of communion meal. I never thought of that before, though I read this book. You know, you read a book and it doesn't strike you. This was a communion meal. And the fact that the matzah on one level is symbolic of the lamb and of the human being, the man, not the child, Warren, the man who was originally killed, is clearly represented in the Christian versions of the Last Supper, where Jesus points or picks up the matzah and says, "Take, eat, this is my flesh," and points to the wine and says, "Take, drink, this is my blood." You see, what's fascinating about the way in which the Christians dealt with this topic is that they were as concerned as all other peoples with the notion that you wasted the best person in the community every year. We were talking last week of why Jews have so many Nobel Prizes and why the Catholics have so few. And the answer is very simple. Catholic priests weren't allowed to marry. So the brightest people were prevented from breeding. Well, they did a little bit on the side, but that was so hush-hush that one didn't know how to follow it through. The Jews, without any shame whatsoever, bred the brightest male in the community with the daughter of the richest man. And if you do that for 2,000 years, you're bound to have a few Nobel Prizes. Now, obviously, primitive societies, and we're talking years, thousands of years, we're talking before the beginning of civilization. Somebody must have cottoned on to the notion that if you kill numero uno every single year, you're going to run out of candidates. I mean, it's hard to find a chairman for the synagogue after a while. Let's displace the topic for a moment. And therefore, the need arose. We don't know whether it was a burgeoning sense of civilization. We don't know whether it was a burgeoning sense of shame that the spring could not be consummated without somebody being killed. We don't know what it was, but gradually, very slowly, a move was made from killing an actual human being to killing a surrogate. Those of you who are interested in this topic will know that originally it was the king who died, then a substitute king sometimes was appointed for a period of time. We have this notion of the king must die even at Yom Kippur, although the authors of the Mishnah were totally unaware of it. You see, we carry this stuff unconsciously. It comes out of us without our knowing about it. We think, we sit down at a committee, we make decisions about certain things, we think we're following our own deliberate conscious choices. But what is happening is, deep down underneath, the call of the atavistic and the primitive is coming out. We dance to a choreography at this time of the year, and indeed at all the equinoctial and solstitial periods of the year, to a dance not of our own making. It's deeply rooted in the blood of the human race. Very often it is attenuated. I once spent a New Year's Eve in the Caribbean. It was a very fine way of spending New Year's Eve. And I was surprised at midnight, a few minutes before midnight, the owner of the hotel came around and gave everybody ridiculous hats to wear, and those curly things that if you blow, they make obscene noises, and they go out very long and irritate the people sitting at the next table. And then at midnight, the sedate, middle-aged matrons rushed around, kissing every available man on the lips. I was horrified until I suddenly realized that this is a very worn down, vestigial, barely recognizable rendition of, for example, what happens in Australia, as described in Durkheim's book, The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, when those moments of the year, the vernal and the autumnal equinoxes and the two solstices, are celebrated by wild sexual orgies. I assure you that what I experienced was far from a wild sexual orgy, but that's what it originally had been, apparently, several millennia before. It had sort of run down a bit. And had you told these people that what they were doing was participating in a ritual which was once a very serious business, they would have been very surprised. They thought they were having a good time. The idea that this was related to a primordial celebration which involved a kind of permissible social chaos in which everything was turned upside down. You have other vestigial traces in the British Army, maybe in the American Army too, but I wouldn't know because I wasn't there. I was in the British Army. At Christmas time, officers serve the other ranks. Do you have that custom in this country? No? Well, you're a democracy, you don't understand these things. In England, at Christmas, this is another vestigial trace. One of the essential things was that very often a slave was chosen to be the surrogate king. That everything was turned upside down at this time of the year, and the slave was allowed to enjoy all the prerogatives of royalty until the day of reckoning, when he was torn to pieces and devoured. We have other examples. So what we have to bear in mind when we discuss this topic is the difference between the original primordial sacrifice of the spring, with all its full-blooded spirituality, as it were, the sort of thing that Mary Renaud describes in the last chapters of The King Must Die, that incredible sacrifice of Pentheus, the Dionysiac rites. She describes, perhaps that's one of the most vivid descriptions we'll ever get. It's almost like a journalistic account. I was in this island, the journalist writes in the New York Times, page 3, and a remarkable festivity took place, except for poor old Pentheus, of course. The wildness, the savagery, the total unbridled outburst of human passions. Oh, I know we're not going to have anything like that tonight, but we're just interested in... Oh, Carol says, don't be so sure. Well, so we have to, first of all, bear in mind the difference between a vestigial trace of a primitive ceremony and the original full-blooded affair. We've forgotten the original. We'd be very surprised. Mary Renaud has got closest to it in that frightening description of the celebration of the festival of Dionysus, which incidentally was very much a spring celebration, the celebration of the festival of Dionysus. Now, here is another example to indicate what we're talking about. The anthropologist Robertson Smith has described a scene which he himself witnessed, namely a group of Arabs in Africa, this is from the 19th century, at dawn, descending upon a live camel and tearing it limb from limb, devouring all of it at that very moment when the sun rises above the mountains. The idea, obviously, is that there is an attempt to incorporate the power, the strength, the force of the living animal. And the stress in the Torah and in Jewish tradition, both the idea that you only can have a lamb in terms of the size of the family, and that the lamb must be eaten completely, none of it must be left over. This all points in the direction of the notion that the original Passover was a totem feast. Now look how the Christians solved the problem. In a sense, they solved it rather remarkably. They too wanted to get rid of the notion that every year a man had to be killed. What they did was they created a once and for all situation where one man would be killed and that would be it. Unfortunately, as Jews know to their cost, they still went out and beat up Jews on Easter. So you see, the fact that you try to avoid as it were, the unconscious challenge, the need to do this, for some primitive reason which we are not fully conscious of, Christianity tried, but the evidence from the standpoint of the Jewish people, certainly, it was not a great success. Spring was characterized, certainly in the shtetl, by the fear of annual pogroms, when the priests very often would rouse the mob to fury against the Jews who had been the ones curiously accused of killing their Messiah in the first place. So it was a good idea. The idea was to have one crucifixion, a once and for all crucifixion, which would obviate the need to have any further crucifixions. So what we are dealing with here today then, and what the Passover is about, two things. Number one, the need on the part of the people to have some kind of a spectacular spiritual experience at the turn of the season, at spring. It happens on all the other occasions during the year, autumn and also winter, midsummer. We're talking now about spring. And the attempt on the part of the growing ethical conscience of the various groups to transmute, to find surrogates, to mitigate the effects, but we know that going back to the very beginning, there's no question that the original sacrifice was a human sacrifice. The lamb, the shank bone of the lamb on the Passover table is a surrogate, represents that original primordial sacrifice, and the tradition of breaking the middle matzah into half and half of it being reserved for the afikomen, the fact that the afikomen has to be eaten at the end, and that ideally speaking one matzah should serve the entire family, although one usually finds that if one has a large number of people, you can't share just half a piece of matzah. You have to add to them. But that carries within it the overtones of this primordial sacrifice. I wanted to talk about the need for this, because it seems to me that since Passover then does deal with the question of leadership, it does deal with the question of leadership. After all said and done, the central argument between Rabbi Kaplan and the traditional Haggadah is that the traditional Haggadah does not mention Moses. And Rabbi Kaplan reintroduced the name of Moses into the Haggadah. Of course, the question is, why doesn't the traditional Haggadah mention Moses? After all, Moses was the man who led the children of Israel out of Egypt. Doesn't he get a bit of credit? What is the normal answer that's usually given to that question? The Jewish people want to attribute everything to God because they believe in a supernatural God, and therefore God is a very jealous God, and God wants to have all the credit and all the kudos. And God was jealous and didn't want Moses to have any of the glory. Same thing happened in the story of Hanukkah. God wanted all the credit. We know that Judas Maccabeus fought. We know that the brothers of the Maccabees fought. We know that Jews fought and died against the Syrian Greeks. But no, if you read the prayer book, there's no reference to the Maccabees. It's just God did everything. Why is it then that Moses is not mentioned in the Haggadah? Why is it the Maccabees are not mentioned in the prayer book? Only that God delivered the few from the hands of the many, the weak from the hands of the strong. Why? Does anybody know an answer? Why is Moses not mentioned in the traditional Haggadah? Yes, Elisha.
There's frequently an attempt to avoid mentioning persons' names so they don't get worshipped later on.
Yes, that is almost certainly a very good reason why Moses is not mentioned, because we know that in the ancient world human beings were often worshipped as gods. The Egyptian Pharaoh was worshipped as a god, whereas in Israel only God was to be worshipped. But I have a funny feeling that there's something else involved here, that somehow our ancestors, who possessed a kind of a genius for this sort of thing, they were geniuses of the unconscious without having read a word of Freud. It took us 2,000 years to work out theoretically what I'm convinced they knew intuitively. They knew of the great danger of permitting anything to be worshipped that was tangible. Because, in other words, to safeguard this terribly dangerous force within the human community, which led mankind for thousands of years to sacrifice their king or their leader every spring, that this force was safe only if it related to God. That is to say, somehow it was an attempt to try to divert the power of the leadership of the people to God, so that Moses could say, don't complain to me, call the boss, a kind of a deflection. A little bit like what we have in English politics, whereby the Prime Minister becomes the butt of all criticism, but the Queen is above criticism. Nobody ever, that's not even true anymore. I was going to say nobody ever criticizes the Queen. Yes?
Mention here that Moses was really almost a random person taken to carry out the will of God.
Did you say random? Did you say random?
In the same way that in the modern interpretation of that movie with John Denver being chosen, just at random.
Well, I'm sorry, what was that movie?
Oh God. With George Burns playing the role. The point is that, my point, it didn't matter that it was a person whose name happened to be Moses, or it didn't matter that in modern neo-theology it was a person whose name was whatever John Denver was portraying. It's just that there was a person through whom God worked, and the person was completely immaterial and irrelevant. It could have been anyone.
All right, I'll buy that. Now, let me try to express an idea which I don't fully understand, so we're going to have fun, right? John Belushi. I didn't hold any brief for him. I'm sorry he's dead. I mean, I feel sorry for him. I mean, I wouldn't even have known about him. I mean, most of my friends never even heard of him. I mean, I happen to have teenage children, so I have to suffer through movies like the Blues Brothers. I mean, did anybody see it? I don't know whether there was any great talent in the man. I mean, de mortuis nil nisi bonus. I was terribly overwhelmed at seeing the way he was memorialized, the people that came, their reactions. And it suddenly occurred to me that we live in a whole different world today. I'm talking about worship. I'm talking about people to worship. Look at Moses in the wilderness, the terrible danger that he was in. I'm not surprised that Freud wrote a book in which he claimed that the children of Israel, in fact, killed him. There's not much foundation for that. And Freud was perhaps nodding a little in some of his wilder enthusiasms in that book. But it's an interesting notion. Freud himself, of course, as you know, believed in the primordial myth, which was the beginnings of all society. He was prepared to call it a just so story, but nevertheless, even though he said it may never have actually happened the way he described it as happening, in terms of the human mind, in terms of human myth, in terms of the human psyche, It's something that is relived in every generation between every parent and every child. Freud's story was originally society consisted of hordes of people dominated by the strongest male. And all the women belonged to this strongest male. And the young male children, as they grow up, either had to leave or be castrated. There was no room for more than one strong man in one group. And then Freud says what happened was that the brothers decided that they wanted a piece of the pie. And they banded together, and they killed the father, and they ate him. They killed him because they hated him. They ate him because they loved him. This, of course, would be the original paradigm of the Jesus story, and of the matzah, and of the lamb, and of all the other things, and of the golden calf, and of all the other things that are consumed in order to give the community a sense of being together, a sense of being whole. This, of course, did not solve the problem, because the brothers then proceeded to quarrel between themselves about the women. And finally, according to this somewhat far-fetched story of Freud's, exogamy was instituted, whereby the men could only choose wives for themselves outside of the clan, and the guilt and the love for the dead father led to the institution of an annual sacrifice in which an animal representing the dead father was solemnly killed and eaten by the family, in which they reaffirmed their devotion to the original man whom they had killed. Now, of course, it's very hard to be precise about the details, but let's just look at Moses, for example. Moses in terms of the Jewish people. There were no John Belushis in the wilderness. There was Aaron, but he doesn't seem to have been much of anything to worry about in terms of competing with Moses. There was no television, there were no film stars, there were no movies, there were no newspapers. The entire focus of 600,000 people was on one leader. Let's just envisage that for a moment. I mean, the Bible gives us no grounds to believe that anybody competed with Moses for the leadership. That it was Moses and it was God. Now, the intensity of the relationship between Moses and the people must have been of a prodigious order. It's almost a totally authoritarian situation, in which Moses and God are almost one and the same. The laws are given and the people must accept. If one can hypothesize that every human being who is born has some possible quality of leadership within him, but if it's too weak, he doesn't know what to do with it. So what he does is he waits around for somebody who, for him at least, appears to be somebody who could be his leader, gives the portion of potential leadership that he has to this person, and then gets a double measure. Not only is the person reflecting towards him his own already given leadership, but something is added. That is to say, in order to have the kind of situation that you had in the wilderness, you had to have a man, Moses, and you had to have all those 600,000 people, I use the figure just loosely, who were prepared to give up a very important part of themselves so that Moses could have invested with such enormous intensity that he could come down from a mountain holding two pieces of rock, and they would believe that these rocks came from the God who created the entire world. Now that's one side of the spectrum. Now what is happening today is that the world is full of Moses. It's like a polytheistic situation. People relate to film stars today the way they used to relate to a person like Moses, only it's spread. One almost might say that the John Belushi syndrome is a very good thing, because the more Elvis Presleys, the more John Belushis, the more people are celebrated in that marvelous magazine called People every week, the less danger is that any single person will be able to attract to himself that intense amount of adulation such as Moses must have had, which is a very dangerous, volatile quality to exist in any community. What we have today is a widespread. Now, of course, we have relapses. We've got Billy Graham, and we've got also Adolf Hitler. See, what happened in the case of Adolf Hitler is You had a kind of repetition of what happened in the wilderness with Moses, but on a different level. One was on an ethical level, one was on an unethical level. The process works regardless of the ethics. That's the tragedy. These processes which we Reconstructionists talk about, God, the power that makes for salvation, only work if you have ethical people. You know, it's like the best constitution is no good if you have rotten people, and the worst constitution is fine if you have good people, because ultimately the people decide what goes on. But here we have a situation where from time to time it recrudesces. What is the goal? What is the ideal? I'm asking this question not rhetorically. I want some response from the congregation. I don't know the answer to it. Is the goal that then there should be no heroes at all? I'm going to give an exaggerated hypothesis to discuss. That the ideal dream to which we all aspire, for which we should pray in synagogue, that everybody will be able to be so possessed with their own autonomy, everybody will feel so good about themselves that they won't have the need to give a very precious part of themselves away to somebody else in order to enjoy it vicariously. You see, the process works for communities as a whole. We've gone through this so often before. If you want to know how it works, any book by Peter Berger will help you. Every society creates laws, externalizes them, objectifies them, insists that they are given by God, and then relates to values and laws which they themselves have created as if they originate from outside of them completely. And the idea is that somehow if we feel we are in charge, we don't feel in charge. That somehow every society needs some kind of objectification of its development in order to be able to function. Human beings cannot function if they believe that everything they do is subject to a referendum. Every 5 minutes you have to make a decision. It's like a commune. Everybody comes in. Somebody wants to go to the bathroom, you have a referendum, a vote. Somebody wants to have egg on toast, you have a referendum. So the question is it possible to conceive of a time when Hitlers will be no more, when it will be possible for every human being to be his own leader, to be able to do the best possible with the quality of born leadership, and there will be no need for leaders of any kind? I'd like some response to this. Yes, Joel?
You asked before whether anybody really challenged Moses for leadership, and obviously in the Bible we don't see anybody.
Oh, yes, we do. Korach.
I want to ask about some mythical person, perhaps. Is it not possible that there was, in fact, a leader of the element that got together to build the golden calf, and that person existed and had prominence at that time, but that when the Bible was codified and there was a realization that Moses had to be acknowledged as the leader, that person's reputation and whereabouts was snuffed out or pushed aside so that there would be no memory of him, because that would represent a kind of threat to the acknowledged leadership by the majority of Moses.
It may well be so, Joel, but I would still insist that the artificial schematic polarity that I set up this morning still has to be reckoned with. Even if there were a half a dozen potential revolutionary leaders with Moses, the difference between what happens today, whereby every street corner you have another hero. As a matter of fact, all you have to do is to read Time magazine for a year. Every few months there's another hero, and you don't hear about the old one. So what used to be focused in former times on one human being is now dissipated. Incidentally, the same was probably true in the Middle Ages. The priests and the clergy and the aristocracy, the first and the second estates, as they used to be called, were so far removed from the masses. There was no way to criticize. There was no way to argue. In the Bible, Miriam has a complaint to make about she doesn't like Moses' girlfriend. She doesn't like Moses' girlfriend. She's smitten with leprosy. I mean, today, there's no such thing. We relish showing how our leaders have clay feet. The one picture of President Reagan, for whom I hold no brief, visiting the flooded states this week, was of him having got his foot stuck in the mud. I mean, it's typical of America. They couldn't show him consoling a widow who lost her house, or talking to a child who was miserable because his teddy bear was lost. They waited until they found him losing his balance with his foot stuck in the mud, and that was the picture that was blazoned on in the New York Times. I mean, this is a very deep-seated need in the part of people to trip up those who lead them. I'm raising the question again. Is it possible for human beings to be their own leaders, the way Jeremiah said it a few weeks ago, and I will remove the heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh. They will no longer need to have an external Torah. I will write the Torah on the insides of their hearts. Lainey.
It seems to me that what you're talking about is the human need for transcendence, and I don't see how you're going to get away from that. I mean, the solution that monotheism tried to put together was a solution where you had an all-powerful God upon whom you would focus all of that energy.
Right.
So there wouldn't be a human being
Right.
who would focus that energy on. But to say that you're going to eliminate that totally, I think is unrealistic. So the only question is, what is it that thing is going to be? Because I think that in the end, it's going to either be patriotism. In other words, either patriotism toward a country or toward an ideal, or it's going to be religious fervor toward a transcendent God, or I can't imagine that there's going to be something, because as soon as human beings are aware of their mortality, part of the human condition, I think, is to fight that mortality, and the way to fight that mortality is to connect yourself to something which has has a past and a future beyond what your life is. You talked about taking your portion and giving it of leadership, I think it's more complicated than that. I think it's giving up part of your mortality to create an immortality. And I don't think that there's a way to eliminate that without radically changing
Human nature?
psyche.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Lainey is of the opinion that we will always have heroes, or we'll always have the need to have heroes, because the human psyche is so constructed that the need to worship will never be satisfied by autonomous means. I haven't found the right language to talk about this with, although of course there is a jargon that one could use. I mean, there is a well-known classical study by Freud on this topic. It's called Group Psychology, I think, an analysis of the ego, where Freud draws attention to the different kinds of entities you have, like in the church, or in the army, or in a collectivity like the Jewish people, the different ways in which leadership comes up. Could we have some more responses to this notion? Yes, Matthew?
I think we may be talking about some different things. One, as far as the Belushi phenomenon and those heroes, that strikes me as that Greek love for immortality. And we find someone who has risen above, achieved some fame, and we mourn the fact that fame is mortal. And it's not the same thing as leadership. As far as the leadership you're talking about, leading the community, I don't think it can be individual. That's a relationship. It's not what one achieves in oneself, but it's a relationship between you and your community. And that relationship is based on something outside of yourself, often on authority, which is a common, and we often refer back, authority often refers back to the foundation of the community. And the leader acts as though he is regenerating the spirit which created the community. And that's partly religious, and it is that tie from past, present, to the future. So it has to be outside of himself. And it has to be in the name of the community.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes.
What I was going to say is that it reminded me a little bit of children, not, although they want to assert themselves and make their own decisions, they're fearful of really feeling that they have control because they feel they may lose control. And if the parent reaffirms them and says, essentially, no, I'm not going to let you get out of control. There are limits and there are rules and there are boundaries, and you have to live within them. And that this process of externalizing, whether it's your Constitution or your code of law, is a protection. And you don't really want to feel that you do have the ultimate control, that there are boundaries, because we're all aware of the fact that we can go too far.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. Myron?
2 points. The first one is about the people you pick. I guess 3 points. First, like John Belushi and so on. I don't think they were the people you should have chosen. John Lennon is the much better example. So we still worship today. In another 3 weeks, John Belushi is going to be forgotten except for a revival of his movies every once in a while. But if you listen to the rock stations, over and over again, almost every day, 3 or 4 times a day, you will hear Imagine and Instant Karma, which are John Lennon's 2 religious songs. And there are shrines to John Lennon. People come the first year, they come and pay homage and so on to him. And I think that's a different level of functioning, and it had more to do with also a message that John Lennon had. It was beyond just being a performer. And Elvis Presley, for instance, has died as a legend in many ways. Even in the South, his museum had to close, the cemetery has been desecrated, and so on. They can't even make money out of it anymore. The second point has to do with you're saying that our leaders have clay feet. And that's a very dangerous thing, because I think it was you that pointed out maybe 2 or 3 years ago, Bar Mitzvah class, when the book came out about the Supreme Court. I can't remember the name of it. The Brethren. And how all the liberals were so upset about all the nasty things going on in the back room. And your comment was that the mystery of the Supreme Court was taken away. And once that mystery is taken away, we no longer can respect its decisions. And what we did was, and I still do, and I think most of us do, is that we'd like to let the Supreme Court do it. We don't know how they do it, but somehow or other we want that ultimate arbitrator up there that we'd like to idealize and think of as clean and holy, without any clay feet, being able to make the decisions that we can't make or are unwilling to make or unable to make because of the nature of society. And so it has to be, in a sense, holy and clean. And we don't want to know about it. And in the same sense, I know that, like, I don't want to know about authors of books. I don't care about their lives or anything. I care about what they're saying, what goes on in the book. That's more important. It doesn't have anything to do with the book, from my point of view. The third point, just the last one, has to do with what I think you were talking about now. When you talk about that autonomy, we have to take it away from Western religion and look at Eastern religion, where I think that the ultimate course is exactly that. And it is only available for a few people. The idea of becoming a totally autonomous person within the reflection of the karma of the universe. And that, of course, is only for people who have left society and cannot function, and do not want to function.
Of course, what you've done by that last point, of course, you've given us a problem, a good problem. That is to say, you've reminded us that Judaism separated itself from that viewpoint, that Judaism insisted on individuality, not that collective miasma in which everybody just merges into everything else. So individuality is a very crucial thing. So it may well be the problem with Judaism is that we have to have individuals, and we have to have separateness. There will be leaders, and the question is, what do you do if you no longer have the supernatural God? This must become a serious political question for Reconstructionism, of course. As long as you have the supernatural God, you're fairly safe. As Laney says, there you have all the power concentrated, and you can't do very much about it. We have a whole slew of people trying to say something. Yes?
I just thought it was an interesting idea of donating power to other people to make a unified hero of the Thunderbird. And it just, I thought that in kind of a group therapy session with a psychiatrist, in front of you kind of donate power to the psychiatrist to run the group. Kind of thing. You do this in everyday life with friends, and the ultimate idea to me to achieve personal power and power in any group in terms of even electing a political official would be to donate the power with a sort of in trust. If you don't have enough yourself, you give it up so somebody else can either teach you how to use it, or you can get strength from the other person with the full knowledge that you can get it back and be better for it. And it's in the mind of the giver that makes the difference in that. It's I choose to give you power, and you keep it for me and teach me how to use it better, and then maybe I can get more power and be equal. If that doesn't happen, one time I think it was you who mentioned that the reason that Israelis hate the Americans sometimes is because they're dependent on it for money, sometimes children from their parents because they're dependent on it. If that exchange, the respect of that exchange doesn't happen, we will hate our leaders, we will trick them up, and we will not want them to be better than us. But it's us who has to believe that this is what we're doing.
Yes, that is an excellent point which resolves the problem that Lainey was talking about before. I asked the question, are we always going to be doomed to a situation in which people will have to give something from themselves? You know, the word charismatic, which is what we're talking about this morning. We're talking about charismatic leadership. The word charismatic comes from a Greek word which means gifts of the gods. From our Reconstructionist, religious humanistic point of view, the gifts are given not by the gods, but by the people in the community that want to give that power to the individual who leads them. Lainey said that the question I asked was, will this always be necessary? Or maybe will there come a time when people will not need it as much as before, and perhaps that the present situation in which we find ourselves, People magazine syndrome, where every other day there's another hero that people are worshipping, is a good thing, although not as it is, but as a way stage to something else. That what's happening now is a breakdown of this massive transference onto some Moses figure, the kind of Genghis Khan or the Hitler figure, where all the power is possessed without the individuals who gave the power being able to take it back again. It's not given in trust. It's in a blind, kind of primitive way, through the people syndrome, in which we have a multiplicity of heroes that saves us, hopefully, from any single person capturing the imagination of masses of people and causing us harm, to an ultimate goal where we will all be able to divest ourselves from the need both to be a hero and to hero worship. Now, your point is excellently made. What is being said over there is that maybe the height of maturity is to realize that psychically we are so constructed that we need to worship, but that mature worship is worship which is set up within a framework in which we give what we give in trust, and we can take it back when a sufficient number of us want to take it back. The simplest example I can think of is we elect a president of the United States for 4 years, and we give him an enormous amount of power over our life and death. We can't ask for a referendum every 5 minutes. The man is elected, this time with massive support. You can't hold referendums every 5 minutes. That would destroy democracy. You have a 4-year rule. At the end of that 4 years, if that man has alienated a sufficient number of the population, he goes. That power within a democracy is power given with trust. And your point is excellently made. I could have dealt with it on a theoretical level, but I didn't want to, because, yes, Dr. Goodgold? Please be brief, because we have several people wanting to talk, and I want to talk too. Natch, go on.
The basic thing is, the Christians do this very well. You know, they started the world off with chaos. Chaos was there, was all over, and then it evolved from it. So organization had to be set up. Now, the world today is, of course, much more complicated than it was in Greek time. It's complicated to the point where many, many people don't understand what's going on in this world. Just don't understand. Your average person being specialized in one thing, but he doesn't know what's going on in the rest of the world. He has to look for somebody else's support. The world's much too complicated. I think as we go on more and more with a complicated world, with all its various forms of computers and everything else, people are more and more confused, and more retreat within themselves. Now, man by nature is a gregarious animal. There's no question about it. Man has to associate with other men. There's no question. This is a part of human being nature. And in order to do that, somebody must speak for it. And he's always going to look for a leader. No matter what society you're in, no matter how bright they are, you find that all groups, all levels of society, all levels of education, there's always some leader. And I think this always will be the...
Jack?
I think there are a couple of points. I won't number them like Myron does, because then I'll have to keep adding. But I think I doubt there are as many great heroes in the past as we appear to give credit to, because we lump long historical periods together and we can find a few good people. I think we live under the supposition that we should have more great leaders than we do. I'm not sure if that's true. Great leadership is rare. I think it's harder because of technology. You cannot have politicians do what they used to do 40 years ago. It's go to one area of town, say something on one corner, and then go to the other ethnic neighborhood, say something on the other corner, and do that because on the 6 o'clock news, they're going to be made to look like a complete fool as they videotape each of those and play them next to each other. The man won't have a dime in his kitty the following morning. So you can't work on that kind of level. So you can create, and in the same way that someone who was a great speaker, perhaps in his village 4,000 years ago, could have got up on the corner and baffled everybody in the neighborhood so that they didn't understand him, and they said, this guy's amazing, he's a genius, or he's crazy, or whatever, and he'd have a following. I'm not so sure that when you have high technology, you produce a John Belushi whose movie or his first appearance on Saturday Night Live was seen by more people than Moses ever led. I can't see how, that's part of your problem, but the saving grace of it is the same technology is going to produce, if you read who the author is, and I share Myron's feeling, if I enjoy something on a certain level, I have a great fear of pursuing it beyond that level sometimes, because when I do, I'll discover I can't enjoy it anymore. But Belushi is a perfect example of someone, you keep reading the paper, which I avoided doing, but I do drive in the car and have a radio. You keep hearing the facts about this thing. And if you were enamored of him in the first place, and then you saw the way he died, and what was in his bloodstream, then, unless you've got severe problems of your own, you can say this was a passing phenomenon, and the man was devoid of good sense, minimally, and beyond that, a lot of other things. So I think we have a problem with technology. Saving grace is we create something very quickly, and it gets destroyed just as easily. I think our society suffers from an extremely short attention span. And if you want to start that with the Sesame Street phenomenon, where the children are drugged into only being able to watch the television 3 minutes at a time, the parents are just about as bad. I taught kids who now aren't kids anymore, they're parents, I guess. They'd be in their 28 to 32 or something. And they had attention spans maybe of 7 minutes. I think it's shrinking. And I think you can create these phenomena, but they won't last. And that's the state of the truth.
Thank you. John?
I'll try to be quick. One, I think we're using the word leadership.
You can have 7 minutes, John.
I may take this.
Go.
I think we're using the word leadership without much precision. John Belushi and talking about the president in the same breath, it's a very different kind of relationship. Or the people in People magazine. One are individuals who are risen to a certain level of visibility. Whether or not they're leaders, in the sense of Moses, is questioned. If leaders define particular kinds of things, I would question people that have a certain level of public visibility, as in fame and recognition, whether they can move people on political and social issues and/or religious issues is at least open to question. Some have gone into that arena. Two, simply question, yes, we will never be able to write our own Torah on social and political issues. Social purposes require large organization. All organizations have a tendency towards hierarchy, towards a non-equal distribution of authority, and therefore there will be leaders. Whether individuals like us will retain spheres in our own personal, family, communal lives to write our own Torah might be the challenge. But whether in the broader social and political arena we are all going to write our own Torah and have a referendum, I think it is, at this level of social and political complexity, not an issue. Final just comment. I question whether Moses had that kind of relationship with 600,000 people. There wasn't the technology in place, there wasn't the level of communication. Often it's referred to as he related to the elders. And in fact, there is no way that he could have had, in my view, a relationship other than a mythological relationship, totally from apart, but without anything that even begins to have the face-to-face hearing communicative thing. I would imagine it was an indirect, decentralized pattern of leadership in the Jewish people, which was characteristic of all traditional society. There was no direct relationship. So when you use that as a parallel, at least that's a question.
The fact that it's mythological makes it more intense, not less intense.
Maybe.
I would have thought that the less they know, the more intensely they felt.
How much they knew. You know what the levels of communication were in the people.
Yeah. Mark?
That's what Moses is now, but not then. I mean, they didn't know it. We know it.
And they never put the men after. If it's all in fun.
Mark?
Just to agree, what John mentioned, the Torah does account for...
Could you stand up, Mark?
The Torah does account for Yisro's coming to Moses and said, you can't sustain this.
Yes.
Even if you did have this original leadership, it couldn't be sustained. I have to break it down into tens, hundreds,
Yeah.
leaders of tens, hundreds, and fifties. The main point is there may have been times in history when communities were smaller, where everybody was leader. I'm thinking of the Greek city-states, where everybody had a chance to be leader. There was rotation. It was when it was really face-to-face democracy. I'm also thinking about times in Orthodox Judaism where everybody was more or less versed in custom, so everybody could adopt, everybody understood. However, as the point has been made, when societies grow and become more complex materially, politically, of necessity, economically, then very, very difficult to sustain.
Yes. Jeff?
Might be that everyone can adopt them, but still they want a rabbi to whom they can turn to for some kind of ethical final word. I think that the search for leadership is something which is endemic within biological existence on this planet, genetically, going back as far as possible. The existence of life owes its presence to the sun, the one source of all radiant energy which empowered us and endowed us with this life force. And that as biological structures became more and more complex, they continuously depended upon the sun. And when human beings, and empowered with their ability to foresight and to think and to build stories, transfer this need for power, the sun, they transfer it to a human leader. Animals need leaders. There's a leader of the wolf pack, there's a leader of lion packs, there's a leader everywhere, in every single community. Every biological organism demands and has leadership. And I think that it's genetically within our fabric that we're going to have to find leaders, and that there will be very few Lamavavniks around. And those will be the people who are the foci.
Yeah. Okay, this has to be the last comment. I want to sort of pick up some of these topics.
You asked a very good question on why Moses is not mentioned, and what happened to the Maccabees. The Maccabees is I think what they were saying was, beware of deification of anyone or any group. The Maccabees had no problem. They were wonderful heroes and turned out to be rotters. They were the worst in terms of being Israel. Terrible things. With Moses, I think they had a stretch of it more. I've always wondered why Moses never crossed over. They had to reach over. He spoke. He was supposed to speak to the rock. He struck it. That's really reaching to find a little blemish, so you could say, a wonderful man, but beware of deifying him. And I think that's the message to me that gets in there. You can have leaders, but they are only leaders. He did all these things. The rabbi didn't say he did not. They didn't say the Maccabees weren't leaders. But they did say, beware of deifying. You get on to your next question. Can we be free? Can we, express ourselves? Can we grow internally? Yes, but beware of deifying the leader. You can follow him, he's there, but grow yourself and know that he can.
Thank you. The problem which we started from, we've come some ways, and I agree with John, the definitions are a little vague, and there's no way in which we can establish or demonstrate this point. What I'm curious about is, how did people feel about Moses? This is a rhetorical question. There's no way of finding out. How do people feel about their leaders today? Would it not be true to say that in the modern world, at least, certainly in America, the need for leaders has been watered down to some extent by the plurality of people around who are visible and who, as it were, take away some of the energy or some of the tension from this. Let me get back, however, and I was concerned primarily about the fact that when you have the leader, the tensions between the leader and the community are very divisive and very destructive, you see. It's all right to say, well, you have to have a leader, but then the fact of the matter is that the leader ended up getting crucified at this time of the year, and people try to avoid that. In other words, there's a kind of a tragedy built into this. There's a tragedy built into this. Society cannot live without leaders, and it cannot live with its leaders. That's the tragedy that the spring seems to celebrate. Now, let's go back to the point of eating, or incorporating, or taking in. Have you ever been with somebody that you know, the mother and the father, and you suddenly say to the person, my heavens above, you're just like your mother. Or my heavens above, you're just like your father. Have you ever had that kind of an experience? How does a person's identity become the way it is? How does a person's being, how does a person become the kind of person that they are? Well, you live with somebody for many years, you identify with them, we incorporate, it's the exact word, we incorporate attitudes. You live with somebody who responds to crisis in a certain way, you live with somebody who responds on the telephone a certain way, you live with somebody who reacts the same way when they come home from work every night, who relates to wife or to husband or to parent or to child in a certain way. You begin to take in, you incorporate, you swallow, you take in these different attitudes. Now, the new person has incorporated but is also different. The person in whom we recognize these traits of the father or the mother is like the father or the mother, but isn't. We are not only our parents, we are also ourselves. And yet there is some subtle alchemy whereby in order to be ourselves at our fullest, we have to take in from the original leader or chief or leaders, namely the mother and the father. So when the lamb was sacrificed in spring, which was a surrogate for the king being sacrificed in spring, or his surrogate being sacrificed in spring, something was being worked out on a large collective scale, which is in fact worked out within each individual family on an ongoing scale. In each ongoing family, the king must die. The father and the mother must die, metaphorically speaking, of course. We hope that the children will not take this too literally, seriously, but not literally. In order to emancipate oneself from one's father and one's mother, they must die. Their power, their control must be dissolved, must be completely neutralized. Only then can their attitudes be absorbed and become part of one's own autonomous growth. One of the greatest tragedies and one of the most painful things that happen in every family. We all go through it with our own parents, and we're convinced that we won't go through it with our children. The naive, blissfully optimistic faces of parents who are convinced that when their child becomes a teenager, their child will not do to them what they did to their own parents. My dear young parents, enjoy yourselves for the next few years. You'll soon see that every family has to go through this business. And Freud described it as one of the most painful things that can happen. One of the most painful things for parents to know that the bonds have been severed totally, and for the children to know that they are by themselves on their own. There can be relationships. There is life after separation. But it is a relationship of equals. And woe betide the parent who feels that a claim on the original exclusive power and monopolistic control can be made. Once you have given the keys of the front door away, there is no taking them back. It seems to me that the genius of the Jewish people was not to put one man on a cross permanently, outside of history as it were, to try to obviate the pains of the celebration of spring, nor simply to kill an animal and devour its flesh in a total family communion. The genius of the Jewish people was that they have the father have a dialogue in words with the child on the eve of the Passover. The child asks questions. There is a debate. There is a discussion. There are demands made. They are made within the framework of tradition. And in this context, it seems to me that there are not 4 sons. There is one son who is all the 4 sons wrapped together. All our children are at times wise. All our children are at times wicked. All our children are at wise simple. And all our children at times do not have the capacity to ask questions. And it's very difficult because when these various moods come upon them, it sets up moods in us also. Passover is preceded by the challenge of the prophet Elijah on Shabbat HaGadol, the prophet who will restore the hearts of parents to children and the hearts of children to their fathers. Not in the sense that love is given absolutely, but that love is given on trust, that there is a mutuality and a reciprocity and a recognition that love has to be yielded for love to endure, for control to be yielded, for authority to endure. And so when the father and the children engage in the debate at the eve of Passover, Manishtana halayla hazeh, v'higadet alavincha, that is the way the Jewish people, with its ancient genius, try to work out the challenge of the generations. It's not always easy, and sometimes the family doesn't wait till after the Seder service is over before the shenanigans begin. Many a stain of wine on a Haggadah is evidence of certain exasperated intercalations in the Passover service by disgruntled members of the family. And as a matter of fact, among pre-Passover counseling that takes place in synagogues, rabbis often have to face a great deal of rising anxiety in people who are really very scared to face the whole family. I mean, it's all very well talking about the food and the tradition and the liturgy and the myth, but the fact is you have to face the in-laws, and they're all sitting around the table, and the little digs and the little shtochs and the little overtones, the little nuances and the little recollections. Judaism tries to cope with this. It feels that rather than take one man up and string him up on a cross, every year father and child, parents and children, have to try to relate with each other. The Seder service is a beautiful service. The Passover is a beautiful festival. We anticipate the Passover in our discussion and our study. It's almost unbelievable to contemplate the panorama of history. In that marvelous book by David Attenborough, Life on Earth, 98% of the book deals with the emergence of animals. The last 10 pages deals with man. Looking at the Seder service, it is almost that kind of a paradox in terms of time. 98% of what goes into an understanding of Passover goes back to the most primitive times, long before there was a Jewish people. The last few percent, the last few moments in that calendar are the attempt on the part of our ancestors to incorporate mythologically, not in actuality, the lamb, the communion meal, the unconscious sense that one eats that which is most desirable in order that one may attain the attributes of that which one eats. All of those psychological elements are there, but we do it safely with a piece of Manischewitz matzah or wherever you get it from. This is the genius of the Jewish people, and some of those thoughts ought to be rolling around our minds as we decide to register for Irene Hyman's greatest and most inspiring third Passover workshop. I really hope you'll come along. Some of the ideas that I've been talking about this morning will be picked up in some of the study groups. The person who sits down to conduct a Seder service ought to be a learned Jew. We offer you a possibility over the next few weeks, both in synagogue and at our program sponsored by the Adult Education Committee, to be able to do more than just read those beautiful words and sing those beautiful songs and enjoy that marvelous food, but to have a sense of the majesty, the miracle of human history in general in the celebration of the spring, and Jewish history in particular. We rise for Aleinu on page 194.